Awesome. Welcome to another live Human Leaders expert session. This month at Human Leaders, we've been focusing on an often overlooked subject, the impact of grief and loss in the workplace. All of us have touched grief and loss at some point in our lives, and often these experiences are deeply impactful, yet little space is given to acknowledge them and their impact on our lives, and particularly our professional lives. So we've been exploring this topic this month, and our expert today is Katrina Preisler-Weller. Katrina is a grief and loss expert, educator, and advocate. Through her interactive workshops and storytelling with businesses, schools, and other organisations, Katrina creates a space for all forms of grief to be seen, heard, and acknowledged. She believes that by proactively exploring all the spectrum of emotions, we are better able to understand a response we will all experience in our lifetime, grief. So if you have any questions, feel welcome to share these in the chat or to unmute yourself. And I'd just like to start by thanking you so much for joining us, Katrina. We are delighted to have you with us today to discuss this topic, which I think as we've moved through this month, we're all really realizing resonates for all of us, irrespective really of the landscape of our lives so far. It's something that no human is immune to. I'd love it if you'd start by sort of sharing with us what brought you to this work, to this really important work that you're doing now, a bit about your journey.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited. And yeah, as you've already said, if anybody's got any questions or comments, please just shout out or put it in the chat. I'm really happy to answer as we go along. And, we'll be talking about grief in the workplace, but to be honest, a lot of what I say is relevant to all aspects of life. But I'll try and keep it to grief in the workplace, otherwise I'll be talking for hours. As you've already really introduced me really well, I am a grief expert through life experience and through professional qualifications. So I started in this work about 7 or 8 years ago. It was a result of my mum dying when I was 15 years old. So I was at the time finishing my final qualification, exams at school. I'm trying to decide what it is that I wanted to do in my life, trying to fit in with all my friends, and this massive monumental thing happened in my life, which really changed the trajectory of where I was going. And for the next sort of 7 years, until my mid-20s, I felt very lost. I didn't understand grief. It's not something that anyone had ever spoken to me about. It's not that I didn't have people there. I had my family there. I had some really great friends. But it was that I just did not understand it. And I wasn't able, and I didn't want to really process or understand my grief either. So I just kept pushing it away, which led to some really dangerous behaviors. And it led to me struggling really badly with my mental health. About how long ago now? 6 years ago, the turning point for me was my nephew passed away. He was 5 days old. And I, at that moment, was able to see through my sister, she had twins and my niece survived, the contrast of joy and grief and the fact that they can coexist together. And that really opened my eyes to it and allowed me to really see that I was able to invite happiness in. By inviting happiness in and really embracing life, that didn't mean that I was forgetting my mum. It didn't mean that my grief was going to vanish, but it just meant that I was actually being present, because what's the point in being here if we're not being fully present, right? So I was kind of, again, for the next 2 years, just on my own path, trying to work through all of this. And then when the pandemic hit a few years ago, I was made redundant, and I decided at that time to start a podcast. I'd been volunteering on the side. I was an ambassador for Child Bereavement UK. When I moved to Australia, I was an ambassador for a charity here. And I started a podcast that allowed people to share their stories and their experiences of grief. And I realized how much that helped people to hear other people's stories, but also to be given the opportunity just to share theirs, just to be given the space to have their grief heard and witnessed and validated, because so often it is ignored and it is invalidated by society. We're told to get over it quickly. We're told at least, we're thrown all these platitudes under the sun, and it makes people feel minimized in their grief, and it makes them suppress it, it makes them push it down. So I started this podcast, and from there I just decided I knew this is what I wanted to do. I knew this is exactly what I wanted to do. So I continued. I now deliver workshops, I deliver trainings. I'm a qualified grief counsellor. I have lots of training, particularly in childhood grief. This is something that I'm really, really passionate about. But as grief is pretty much universal, I also do a lot of work with businesses and just work with them to see how can we make the workplace more grief literate? How can we make sure that our policies that we have in place are suitable? And also, how can we become more compassionate leaders? So that's a little bit about me and my reason why. And as I say, a big part of the reason why I do the work that I do is because of my mom and what happened when I was younger. So.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing so candidly, Katrina. And I love that word that you use, grief literate, that you're encouraging businesses to really start to speak the language, and by businesses, I mean the people obviously who work there, so that we can start to have conversations that do go into this topic and start to be able to support each other and to validate each other in this process. And before I delve into I'd love to understand what your definition of grief is, but at first just like to focus, if we may, on, you mentioned that, often in society, the tendency is to sort of brush over grief, to not mention it, to kind of pretend it isn't there. And that, I think, very understandably makes the person who is in grief feel maybe not seen, unsafe to feel their grief, like grief is not an acceptable state for them to be in, and they're thereby sort of invalidated. Do you think that, am I reading that correctly? And why do you think that has historically been the case?
I think because grief is not something we can fix. And as humans, we like to be able to fix things and we like to have the answers. And unfortunately, when it comes to grief, we don't have that. And it's so individual to each person that we just can't have the answers, because even if you're grieving the same person, the same situation as somebody else, you'll be experiencing it differently. The other thing is that often people think that grief is a result of death, and people don't like to talk about death because that's the unknown. So there's a bit of fear there, I think. Usually that's why we use things like platitudes to try and make people feel better, because we're uncomfortable and we don't like to see them sad. We don't like to see them struggling. So we're trying to make it better, when in actual fact, the way that you can support and help someone feel better is just sit and be with them, rather than trying to have all the answers. So I think it's a mixture of fear, a mixture of discomfort, and the unknown.
Yeah, that absolutely resonates. And I think I'm really excited to get to a little bit more of like what we can do to support people in grief a little bit later. But just to start with, I'm curious your own definition of grief. What does that word mean to you?
I always say it's a natural response to any loss. So grief isn't just about death. It can be any significant loss that alters the way our day-to-day lives run. So whether that's the loss of a job, the loss of a friendship, the loss of a pet, perhaps relocating, for example, which you've just done to Amsterdam, and there's a lot of grief involved there. So anything that we identify as a significant loss, regardless of whether the people identify it as that or not, that puts us through a grieving process. It isn't just one emotion. Grief is sort of an umbrella term for a whole response that we're going to feel physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. So there's a lot that goes into it. And a lot of the time people think of grief as sort of in the films where there's somebody wailing in the corner on their knees, crying. But grief is more the inward response rather than the external one that we give out to the world. So the things that most people see, where people wear black and they're attending funerals, that's sort of the mourning, whereas grief is the inward response and expression.
I love that you've delineated their grief and mourning. And I'm wondering, so can you tell me a little bit more, maybe even in a cultural context, what mourning might mean to you as well, just to kind of delineate that a little bit more?
Yeah, mourning for me is the things that people do to signify to others or to memorialize the person. So whether that's a celebration of life, whether that's attending funerals, rituals that they may do, so wearing black. I know in some religions they don't drink, they're not allowed to wear makeup, they can't attend social events, they have to wear black for a year in the Jewish culture, for example. So there's lots of things there, and they're the outward things that everybody can see that signify I have had a loss. I have usually, typically, mourning is related to a death and to a bereavement as opposed to another form of loss. Does that explain
That absolutely helps. Yeah, thank you. So shifting now to sort of looking at grief within the framework of work. And so I think there's historically been this kind of this divide between, you know, humans as sort of private individuals, what happens in our private lives, whether that is the loss of a person or a divorce or, you know, a difficult move or a transition phase in our lives, whatever that might be, and then our professional lives. So how we behave and interact with each other at work, how productive we are. And these are sort of two separate containers, and one shouldn't impact the other. Can you tell us a little bit about your perspective on the impact of grief in the workplace?
Well, I think work and private life just naturally bleed together, even if you don't want it to. And I think that the last few years has kind of shown that with people working from home, and you've been able to see my office, for example, which people wouldn't have been able to do before, maybe a little bit, but not as often. You'll sometimes see people's dogs walking around in the background or their babies crying. And it shows that actually your personal life and your professional life, even if you try really hard to keep them separate, there is always going to be a bit of an overlap, especially when it comes to our emotions. You know, if we're struggling emotionally, we can't just turn that off at the flick of a switch. It would be wonderful if we could sometimes, especially when it comes to grief, but we can't. And therefore, it is going to have a direct impact on the way that we communicate with our colleagues, the way that we approach our work, the productivity that we have, because things like grief alters the way our brain works. You know, there's a reason there's something out there called grief brain, and it's because we get stuck in this fight or flight stress response. So actually all we're trying to do, our body is just trying to get through the very basic functionalities of everyday life. And then therefore things like focus, things like memory, they do fall by the wayside. And that's not something that is always in your control. So it is going to start to impact your work. There's actually studies that show about 1 in 4 employees are grieving at any given time. And that could be any form of loss. Often at work, we celebrate people's birthdays. You know, we bring in cakes for them. We celebrate if they have a baby. We celebrate all these wonderful milestones if they have a promotion. Yet we seem to not want to partake in any of the hard stuff or acknowledging even that something bad has happened. So there's so many times you can see in the workplace that your personal life does bleed into it, but we just don't like to acknowledge that, I think, when it comes to the hard stuff.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely my experience. And I think for a lot of people, it's that we're very sort of natural tendency to focus on these positive things, yay, but almost this kind of, again, there's kind of, if we don't talk about it, it hasn't happened, almost that kind of, and, you know, I love also that you mentioned earlier as well, that for often it's actually our own discomfort that prevents us broaching the topic. You know, we think we don't want to upset that person, but it's actually our own discomfort. And I think being aware that if we can overcome our own discomfort and maybe show that we care, that there is actually, you know, a connection that we can make, and we can be of support in that way rather than just pretending something hasn't happened.
Yeah, definitely.
And I'm wondering, and this is a little bit of a sidestep and a slightly personal interest question, but because I think there's also some shame that comes up often when we experience grief, because of this sort of cultural context in which grief is seen as something to be sort of hidden, that when we are experiencing grief, and I've recently been through a divorce, and I'm still, I think, in a state of grief. And I've really noticed that shame has come to the surface quite a lot as well around that, about acknowledging that I am feeling that state of grief and loss. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of your perspective on grief and shame, and how you, whether you see that as something that comes up quite often for people?
It definitely does, and sometimes it can be a result of societal expectations, but then also it can be expectations that we place on ourselves. When we listen to the words that we use when we're talking to ourselves, often we use things like should, I should be over this by now, I should be feeling good. We also don't want to be that person that constantly is sad, and so we try to hide it and minimize our own grief, and then we build this shame for ourselves, and we put ourselves in a shame hole. And then the other aspect is that if society isn't giving us the space to have those conversations, if there's this toxic positivity around, you know, everything happens for a reason, you can do it, positive vibes only, all of those things, well, that's going to make us feel that we don't want to talk about it, like we can't talk about it, that it's, we don't want other people to feel uncomfortable, and they make it more difficult for us to raise the topic. And also with that misunderstanding about what grief actually is, again, we can start to feel shame around our emotions because we don't necessarily label what we're feeling as grief. And until we label our emotions, often we don't have power over them, and we aren't able to really fully feel into them. So shame is a massive thing that comes up, and I think it's an amalgamation of society and stuff that we put on ourselves. And it takes time to work through, but I think even what you were saying, like the fact that you've just shared that and shared your experience, that's one way to help pull yourself out of that shame. Because if you can be that, often you find that when you're vulnerable with people, they're vulnerable back, and that helps pull yourself out of that shame hole, because you're seeing, oh, other people are receiving this, other people are listening, other people are hearing me. Obviously, unfortunately, you're not always going to get that. There will be people out there that sometimes are just, to put it lightly, assholes, and they won't respond well, but majority of people will. So I think that the way that you can pull yourself out of that shame hole is recognizing the language that you're using, and then finding a space where you do feel safe to talk about it.
Yeah, beautiful. And we've had the comment also that grieving at work always felt very unproductive to me, so almost contrary to what we're meant to be doing at work, what our sort of role is. And I think that's something that's resonates for a lot of us, that it doesn't feel like it's a safe space for it. I'm wondering if so if we don't, you said, you know, it's really important to acknowledge what we're going through and to be able to give our emotions a name. I'm wondering if we don't, is grief something that can then manifest in other ways, that can actually, if we're not dealing with that grief, can it actually come out in other ways, for example, in the workplace, that might not be so helpful?
Oh yeah, definitely, because it can lead to things like anxiety, depression. It can manifest in addictions, in pushing people away, in overworking even. Sometimes people feel that actually work is a really great escape for them, and it's okay to have that as an escape in moments, but when it becomes to the point where you're have a work addiction because you're trying to suppress how you're feeling and trying to basically just ignore it through doing work, that's where the problems arise. So often it is where the biggest thing is where people are replacing their grief with behaviors to try and suppress it and try and ignore it.
Interesting. And I can certainly think of some examples of that in both in professional and private life. So that's a really interesting awareness to have, almost like when we suppress it and we think we've thereby dealt with it, but it also almost sort of sneaks out through the side doors and comes out in other ways that that can feel quite incongruous for ourselves, but it probably also signals that we have some work to do within.
Yeah, and if you don't feel safe in your workplace, then that's also going to have an impact, because if you're feeling all of these emotions and you're struggling internally and you're grieving, and you're not being met with compassionate work and space to be able to move through whatever you're moving through, then you might start to have more conflict with your colleagues. You're probably going to start making more mistakes, because, as I said, you're in that fight or flight mode. Your brain is just trying to focus on surviving, and therefore your memory might go, you might miss appointments, you might have more sick days. So often people who are grieving, you can start to see an increase in absences because they're not being supported at work. So it has a massive impact on not just that individual, but the whole team collectively.
Yeah, it really sounds like that organizational support component can be something that can actually have a huge impact potentially on someone's process of how they're grappling with something. I'd love to sort of switch now to think about that as leaders, I think one of the questions I get a lot about burnout is, how can I support someone who I think is in burnout? And I'm sort of a parallel question. I can imagine a lot of people really want to know how to support someone. And I'd love to hear from you if you can sort of walk us through what some ways are that leaders can adopt to create a safe space for grief to be discussed. And I think also one thing I'm particularly curious about is ensuring that there isn't a threshold to someone sharing that they have something to grieve about, that something is going on in their lives that is causing them loss, even if that's not sort of the traditional ways that we might have identify as sources of grief. So what can leaders do?
So there's a bit of proactive things they can do. So I would say proactively coming on something like this is wonderful, so that you can learn, but not just about how you can support others, but also just learn about your own grief. Because if you understand your own grief more, you're more likely to be able to provide empathy and support for somebody else. The second thing is making sure that your policies are in line to allow people to grieve. So, standardise 2 days compassionate leave is what you legally have to give as a workplace, which is nothing. If you think about the time that it takes to, this is bereavement specific, but to plan a funeral, and to just work through all that paperwork, the first couple of weeks after a person dies is mainly admin. And again, you're in that fight or flight. And then once the funeral's over, that's usually when the grief really hits. So you're only given 2 days. It's nothing. And it's also limited to who, so usually it's for immediate family, so parents or siblings or children. We don't necessarily know the relationships that people have. Your neighbour could be your only friend. Maybe you don't have any family, and therefore if your neighbour passes away, they're not included in that compassionate leave. So really looking at your policies to see if they reflect the kind of support that you want to give to your staff. Making sure that your staff are aware and have, as you say, like already know that they can come and speak to you, or just make you aware. It's not saying that they have to spill their guts and tell you their life story if they don't want to, but making sure that they know that they can come to you and say, look, I'm really struggling, or I need a little bit more time. And if you create that space and that culture before anything happens, then when something does happen, you're more prepared for it. If something has happened and somebody is grieving and they come to you and they tell you I'm grieving, first of all, remove all judgment, remove all expectations. As I say, some people will want to jump straight back into work. It's a sense of normalcy for them. Other people will need a longer time, and I can't give a time frame there, but it's about giving them the space to be able to move through what they're moving through. If that means staggered returning to work, then allow them to do that. If that means working from home part of the time, allow them to do that. A lot of the time people return to work way before they feel able to, because they've got expenses related to the grief that they need to cover. So giving them that patience, but just also having open, honest conversations with them, because at the same time, we do understand that there is a business and there is a team, and we need to make sure that the team also feels supported throughout that time. Not telling everybody straight away what has happened. If that person has experienced a bereavement or a significant loss, don't just assume that they want the workplace to know. Ask them explicitly, do you want me to tell people, or would you rather wait? Because there's nothing worse than experiencing a loss, not actually wanting your colleagues to know, and coming back and people, giving you big hugs, asking how you are. That for some people is the worst thing that can possibly happen. For others, it is the best support in the world. So finding out what that individual wants, not just assuming that that's what they need. And that goes the same for if they say they want to come back to work quickly, allow them to do that, but just have an awareness, in the back of your mind of they might need a bit of extra support. Goodness me, I feel like I'm rattling a lot off here. And the other thing is being aware of what you're saying. So words is a big one. And this is like the biggest thing that I get asked. And I think this is where a lot of discomfort comes from around grief, is not wanting to say the wrong thing and not wanting to upset that person. So often people stay silent because they're worried that they'll remind them of their grief, of their loss, and, make the person cry. But usually the silence is where people feel more hurt because they feel ignored and forgotten. So there's a lot of things that I can say that you should avoid. I'll never say, definitely say this, definitely say, don't say that, because I don't want people to become fearful of speaking. But if you can just be mindful, so anything generally that starts with the words at least is usually not helpful. Whilst what you're saying may be true, it's not supportive in that moment. So just acknowledging them, saying, I hear you, what you're experiencing right now is really hard. What can I do for you right now? Bearing in mind that they may not know what they need for support, but just offering that support. Anything that kind of tells them to just, move over, get on with it, or you can't be like this forever, they wouldn't want you to be sad. All of these kinds of phrases, again, invalidates the person's emotions, invalidates how they're feeling. So just reaffirming to them that you're there and that you hear them. One really great tip is just saying, how are you today? Adding that word today on the end makes it a lot easier for that person to answer. If you say, how are you? Well, you're probably experiencing 500 emotions at once. So it's a very big, overwhelming question, but asking them, how are you in this moment? How are you today? Those small changes in your words can make a massive difference to how somebody responds and opens up.
That is an amazing array of really practical, really helpful tips. Thank you so much, Katrina. And I think, and one of the comments I've had through is that the phrases that start with at least are incredibly invalidating. Couldn't agree more. And I feel like it's for the individual themselves in grief to decide when they are ready to say themselves, I'm in a position now where I can see I'm grateful for having had this particular aspect of this experience, or I can see now that this is happening for a reason. Having that come from someone else, and certainly before they're really ready to hear that, is I think the word invalidating is really big here as well. It's really, and that almost that is a big experience for us as humans, because it can make us feel invisible, unimportant, really not seen and heard, which is something that we definitely need from friends and family, but also from colleagues, from the workplace. So, another comment: hate how are you when in grief. Love to put today on the end. It helps. I now ask on a scale of 1 to 10, where are you? I think that's a really helpful framework as well, because that really brings it down to the moment, rather than having to try and describe the 500 nebulous things that are happening sort of on some level, but really bringing down to like right now, and also grounding me in the present moment, finding that number. So I think that's a really helpful frame.
Yeah, I like that. I like the number. We do the numbers with the kids, and it's an easy way of explaining without having to actually explain your emotions and put names to it necessarily, of just saying, oh, I'm a 3, and then you can leave it at that. You don't have to go into detail. I think that's a really, really good thing. And if you don't know what to say, it's also okay to say, I don't know what to say. I think a lot of the platitudes and things that insensitive things that people come out with is actually just because they get into a bit of a flap and they panic. So they just say what they remember, and they say these off the cuff things without actually having meaning behind it. So I always say to people, if you really struggle, just say, I don't know what to say, but I'm here. It doesn't take much. I think we overcomplicate it. It's really simple.
Yeah, and I think it almost requires us to be a little bit brave and to stay in the moment as well, because I can feel this sense when you're sort of a bit in a flap and sort of flabbergasted, we're kind of almost trying to desperately leave the situation because it's so uncomfortable. So we throw out these platitudes and sort of flee the scene. But if we can actually be present with that person and maybe just say, look, I'm really not sure what to say. If there's anything I can do to support, or those kind of things, and letting the person tell you what they need.
Yeah. And if you're quite a close-knit team already, and you know what that person finds supportive, or what makes them smile, do something like that, like pop a cup of tea on their desk, or ask if they want to go for a walk, or maybe between you at work, that they've got kids at home and they're struggling and they're trying to balance everything. Do a food what are they called, where you will make food on different days of the week and drop it off on the front door. You don't even have to speak to them, but those small things just show that you're thinking of them. And the other thing is, especially for managers or leaders in the workplace, is to note down these dates, these significant dates, just so you're aware, and check in with that person, because there'll be anniversaries, there'll be different times of year, especially with bereavement, where emotions come up. And if we can show that we're proactively just checking in and being aware, that says to that person, oh my goodness, they've not forgotten. You know, they remember. And all it takes is putting a reminder in your diary. It's really not hard. You know, you might forget about it for the next 9 months, and then it will pop up, and you can then show that you're there. And that person might be fine. Also, you know, they might ask for some time off work during that period. I know for me, I never like to work on around the anniversary of my mum, because my brain was just not present. And allowing your workers to have that time, because it isn't just something that stops after a few months or a year. It's something that you live alongside forever. And yes, it becomes softer and the edges don't seem as sharp all the time, but when it does come up, it can hit you like a wave in the face. And, you know, allowing people and having the understanding and the awareness that, okay, yes, it's been 1 year, 10 years, 20 years, they need this time, and that's okay, and giving them that. Because I guarantee if you do that, people will be more loyal to you, they will stay with you, your workers will have more productivity, they'll have a better culture. It's the places where they don't support people during these hard times where they really start to fall apart, and you'll see like quick turnovers, you'll see terrible culture, you'll see people just not wanting to be there. So yeah, doing those proactive small things, it doesn't have to be massive and showy.
A couple of things. One is that, so in the Netherlands, almost every household has a birthday calendar, and it's a something that's like this gift that everyone has one. They're ubiquitous, and you not only put birthdays in there, but you also put death days in there. So it means that over the years, that means you are aware of, for example, a friend of mine who lost her husband very suddenly. You know, I know when his death day is because it comes up in my birthday calendar. And so that helped, you know, that's a really helpful reminder for me that that's a sensitive time of year for her and her kids. So I kind of like that that's building that in a way that almost normalizes is maybe too large a term, but it's kind of making like this is part of life, and that there are births and there are also deaths. I'm wondering also, because I feel like, and particularly, you know, through the pandemic, a lot of us have felt quite alone and isolated. I think this is a big issue, and the US Surgeon General actually wrote a book about loneliness. You know, it's a big issue facing society generally at the moment, and I think also it impacts us a lot at workplaces, particularly where we are either, you know, remote working, and I'm thinking also of you know, a few of us here, like on the call right now, who are living in countries that aren't where we were born. So, for example, you know, our workplace might actually be a really important sort of social connectiveness for us. Do you think there's an important role that leaders can play in support, you know, in this, through this time of being almost a part of someone's community? Is that making too much of it? What do you?
Yeah, no, because one of the important things that can help people navigate grief is support, and that includes not just their family networks, their friend networks, but it also includes their work and their workplace community. So, you know, for some people, as you say, it might be their only really source of connection and support. So I think that we should forget this notion that work is completely separate to life, because it isn't. And for some people, most people spend about 50% of their waking life in work. So, you know, it takes up a large majority of our time here on earth. So to assume that it doesn't mean a lot to people, to assume that it doesn't, that isn't where most friendships are formed, is completely wrong. And I think that most of us know that by now. I think most people have that awareness. So they play a massive part, because if you're having to go to work to, you know, support yourself, and you're not feeling supported at work, then that's only going to have even more of an impact on the emotions that you're feeling as a result of the grief. It's only just going to add to it. So I think I think workplaces need to change their mindset around what is their responsibility and what isn't. First and foremost, it should be the emotional well-being of whoever works there, regardless of grief, being present or not.
I think that's such a profound and powerful statement, and certainly one that resonates for us at Human Leaders. That's an incredibly core component of what we see as work being, and that we're sort of trying to drive that movement towards that being an essential aspect of what we experience in our work lives. Now, I'd love to sort of shift to the Q&A portion, and I'm aware that this is a sensitive topic, so if anyone has a question that they feel comfortable sharing while we're recording, please feel free to share it. If you'd prefer that not to be the case, we'll stop recording shortly and have a bit more time with Katrina if you'd like to ask your question in that setting. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to come through. Awesome. It looks like we might have a bit of a conversation going on after we round up here with you, Katrina. Thank you so much for being with us here at Human Leaders. It's been a delight to learn from you. We really appreciate your candid sharing, and also I think a lot of creating that grief literacy is a really important component for leaders. It's something that we can actually start to do today with each other. And as you highlighted, also it don't have to sort of make it too linear between personal and professional lives. That's something we can do throughout our lives starting today. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.